I'm oral historian Mike Chappell. Today, June 16, 2008, I'm interviewing Dr. Maria New for the Endocrine Society at its annual meeting being held this year at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Dr. New is a past president of the Endocrine Society, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and one of the nation's leading pediatric endocrinologists. Dr. New conducted pioneering research in the area of congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and she discovered a new form of hypertension, apparent mineralocorticoid excess. Currently, Dr. New is professor of pediatrics at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Dr. New, please tell me where your parents were born and what kind of education did they have?
Both my parents were born in Italy, and I'm the first physician because they were musicians and came to the United States to perform. And it was while they were performing in New York that I was born, and hence I'm an American citizen by birth, but they were Italians. And I grew up speaking Italian long before I spoke English. I spoke English fluently, probably not till I was 8 years old. And they came as performers and did not come out of the reason that most Italian immigrants came at the time they came, which was out of economic need. But nevertheless, when it was time for me to become educated, my father decided that I should be educated in the United States. So that's why the whole family moved to the USA. And they moved to New York in an Italian ghetto, which I think still exists on Houston Street. And so that he kept us bilingual, my brother and I, by insisting that we had to speak Italian at home. So if you asked for salt and said, "May I have the salt, please?" you were ignored. You had to say it in Italian, and then the salt was given to you. And so I went at first to a Catholic elementary school, and then later to a high school. It was a very interesting high school. It was called Julia Richmond, where they had very small classes. And the thing that was unusual is that they selected students to teach, so that I learned a little bit about how to get an idea across and how to get an interaction, and I think it served me well throughout my life.
And what was it like for you growing up during the end of the Depression and during World War II?
Well, I remember it very well because musical performances were low, and that my mother then was employed in the Office of Censorship for the United States government. And there was a good reason for that. She was an extraordinary linguist and spoke and read most of the dialects. And so her job was to censor the letters of the prisoners of war, who generally wrote in dialects. So that's how she earned money. And I inherited some of that linguistic ability, but she was really something. And my father then, I don't know, he went to work for something in the military that I never really clearly understood as a child. But I remember very well that we were very hard pressed. It was a time that we were poor, but that my mother saved us through this Office of Censorship employment, which was very good.
What kind of student were you?
What kind of a student was I? Well, I was always a very good student, but I have to tell you, it was because I was driven to do that. I once came home with a report card that had 1 A- on it, and my father threw it at me and said, "Not good enough." And so I knew that I had to prepare well. Now, of course, they were preparing me to go into music. And so I was surrounded by all these musical people. My mother's sister was the first woman conductor in the United States. My mother had perfect pitch and sang, and her mother sang at La Scala di Milano in Italy, which is one of the highest posts you can have. And so my young childhood, even my middle childhood, was that on Sundays when we would gather the whole family for Sunday dinner, something I miss extremely, right after dinner there would be a musicale, and all members of the family would perform and play, and I was asked to do the same, and it was wonderful.
Were you making any decisions? Well, you said you had a musical background. How
Yeah.
did you switch over into, did you have any, at this point in your childhood,
Well,
any ideas about medicine or science?
Please, Mike and Nina, you decide whether I should include this in my interview, but it's the God's truth. I saw what it took to become a good musician in my family, and it's very difficult. There is no room for mediocrity. You're either at the top or you're nothing. And I didn't think I could cut the mustard. And I thought that there was a lot of room for mediocrity in medicine, so I went into medicine. But you better not quote me on that. I'm sorry.
Now, why did you choose to attend Cornell University?
I won a scholarship to Cornell University, and there wasn't a lot of money around, and so my getting that New York State scholarship, which allowed you to go to Cornell tuition free, because it's in Ithaca, New York, that was the prime reason for my selection. And then there was a funny secondary reason. My parents, when they were very young, made an early trip to Ithaca, New York. They don't know, they never could tell me why they were there, but they loved the campus, and they always used to say, if you can go there, go.
What was your major?
I was a chemistry major, and I don't know if you know Cornell campus, but it's very large, it's very beautiful, it's full of gorges. And I had been kept pretty restricted by my family. So it was quite a shock to me when I went into the dorm at Cornell, and girls were walking up and down the corridor nude. I had never seen a nude person, and I was very shocked. But I got a very good education. I majored in chemistry and minored in Latin, and really had a wonderful relationship with my Latin professor, who would love to hear me pronounce O's in Latin because they were Italian O's. And he would say to me, Miss Yondolo with the golden O, please tell me something. And it was wonderful.
Did you meet your future husband while you were at Cornell?
I did. I met my husband in the sophomore year. And I met him at the very end and didn't know whether there would be any renewed visits together. You have to understand that my father and mother did not understand dating. I mean, dating was a foreign thing. They didn't know it. So that before I went to Cornell, I did have what my father would call a suitor. And it consisted of this. He would appear at our home, and his idea was that he'd take me to the movies or something. So my father would say, please come in, sit in the living room, and then he would say to me, go to the piano. And I would play the piano, and when I finished the piece, my father would turn and say, thank you very much, it was very nice to meet you, goodbye. So I didn't have much freedom at all. But when I went to Cornell, I met, it was a co-ed school, and so I met a lot of people, and I met my husband. And when I came back from my junior year, he was waiting for me at the dorm, and history was made after that because we got married. We were the first couple to get married. I was quite young, and that was an interesting relationship because I had to bring my husband to meet my family. And my grandfather was, who reigned over the family, my father's father, looked at my husband, who was very blonde and blue-eyed, and said to me, "He doesn't look Italian to me." And I said, "He's not." And so it all got solved when my husband's mother appeared, who spoke fluent Italian. And the question was this, that she was raised in Rome by her father, who established an international school in Rome that mimicked the Rosé in Switzerland. The concept being that if you can keep children of royal families together in their education, they're very unlikely to make war. And then he was thrown out by Mussolini, and that was it. But this was an interesting marriage on many bases. My husband's family all came on the Mayflower, and I was, by chance, not an immigrant, but my parents were an immigrant. And so my husband opened horizons for me that I never knew. And I was so lucky.
How did you both decide to go to medical school? How did that come about?
Okay. Well, we were both good students, though my husband, who was called Bertrand, he was named after George Bernard Shaw, but he was Bertrand, and he majored in history, which is what his whole family was good at. His father was writing a treatise on how verbs governed history. And anyway, he was a very good student, and I was a chemistry student, and we applied to many schools, and we were automatically rejected because we were married. At that time, married couples were not accepted in medical school. And
so you were applying to medical schools?
Yeah. So when we got to the University of Pennsylvania, which was one of our places, Dean Mitchell interviewed us together. And I had the feeling that he really liked my husband much more than me. My husband had all the credentials. He had gone to the Haverford School, and his mother was a professor of classics, and I was an immigrant from a musical family. Anyway, I said to the dean, "If you like one of us more than the other, it's okay, we'll find places." My husband shot poison dart looks at me at this, and the dean's response was memorable to me, because he said, "If we admit one of you, we'll admit both of you, because you'll work better together than apart." And he made history, because the portrait of my husband and me is sitting at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School.
Did being married did it complicate things at all when you were actually going?
It certainly did. My husband and I were dissecting partners in anatomy on a cadaver. And I was fast and furious, and he was slow and meticulous. And so we could never agree on how the dissection should be done. And I finally appealed to the anatomy professor and said, "Put me on another cadaver, I can't stand the conflict." And that was the way it went.
What was it like being a woman in medical school in the 1950s?
Okay. In the 1950s, in a class of 100 at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, there were 4 women. I was one of the 4. And it was very dramatic for me as I went up the ladder academically and became the chairman of pediatrics at Cornell Medical School, that the class constituency changed radically. It became so that more than half the class were women, and they did very well. I mean, I never sensed at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School that there was any discrimination against the female members of the class.
And then you did your internship at Bellevue Hospital in New York.
Right.
How did that experience shape you as a physician?
Well, you have to know what Bellevue Hospital is like. It is the equivalent of the Charity Hospital or Cooks County. It's the hospital for the poor in New York. It happened to be, I think, the steepest learning curve I've ever had, because the teachers were very good. Bellevue belonged to NYU Medical School, and they had divided the residents into what school you were in. So since I was from Cornell Medical School, there was a Cornell rotation and an NYU, et cetera. And I was very pleased. And I was an intern in medicine, not pediatrics. And I saw probably the sickest patients I've seen in my life. These were people who hardly ever got any medical care. And working the emergency room itself was quite an experience, because the people who were alcoholic, what we called Bowery bums at the time, were highly experienced in getting admitted when it was cold. And if you were a new intern, you didn't know their tricks. And so you would admit them, and then you'd get punished by the hierarchy saying, you know, we know him. But I want to tell you one memorable experience. I was trying to listen to the heart of a patient. And you know, when you want to hear the heart clearly, you generally tell the patient to stop breathing. So I have the stethoscope on this guy's chest, and I said, stop breathing, please. And all of a sudden, I was in a grip from the back. One of the other bums grabbed me and said, how would you like to stop breathing? But anyway, it was a very good experience. I learned an immense amount, but I also learned that I was not comfortable with this kind of patient. Even though I was learning a lot, it was very hard for me to deal with the elderly, decrepit alcoholic person who slept in the street, who was full of fleas and other things. While I found, because occasionally you'd get children in, that it didn't matter to me how dirty or how lice-ridden a child was, I could deal with it perfectly. And it was that changed me to do pediatrics when I realized that I wanted to do genetics. And I was very anxious to take care of patients where the illness was not obscured by the process of aging. So that if I was looking for a genetic illness, I could see it in its pristine state in a small infant. And that's why I changed to go to pediatrics at New York Hospital, which was the Cornell Hospital, not the NYU hospital that Bellevue was.
And now your youngest child was born in this time period, right?
Right. When I was a second-year resident, I had my first child, and I had always thought that I was not very maternal, because I was so driven by my family to perform musically and then academically. But I found after Erica was born, that was really my main center, was to be a mother. And I enjoyed it very much. And I enjoy my children very much. I have 3 children, despite the fact that they used to say to me and my husband how they hated our lives because we were always working and never enjoying. They all ended up going into medicine. Erica, my eldest, who was doing classics at Brown, came home Christmas and said, I want to go into medical school. My son, who was doing cold temperature physics at Harvard, came home and said, I want to be a medical missionary. That changed when he got married. And then my youngest was at Swarthmore, and I think she's the only one that I thought would do medicine from the start. But all 3 of them ended up going to Cornell Medical School, and I was very lucky because as a professor I got a scholarship for their tuition.
Now when they were growing up, did you have help?
Yes, I had an incredible babysitter who was an African-American woman who is not educated but was brilliant. She was a natural mother. And I believed in Betty Madison was her name, so much that when she said to me, I want to have a child of my own, but I can't. And I managed to get a UN child to be adopted by Betty and her husband. And I follow that child now. It's very successful.
And then in 1957, you took an NIH Fellowship.
Yes. I was awarded an NIH Fellowship after I finished my residency. That was my first fellowship. And you could get an extramural NIH Fellowship, and that's what I got. And it was with my mentor then was Norman Kretschmer, who was a nephrologist, and he taught me a lot of nephrological techniques. And at the end of the first year, he was appointed as chairman of pediatrics at Stanford. So he left Cornell, and I had to find another mentor. And my initial mentor was George Reeder in public health. And I was in what was called then the Diabetes Study Group. And that was a very wonderful experience in public health. And you realize I was trained first in medicine, and I was in pediatrics, and I was going back and forth. And it was in the middle of that year that Dr. Ralph Peterson came from the NIH and recruited me as a fellow in adult endocrinology. So my endocrine training was not in pediatrics, it was in adult endocrinology. And I think I benefited a great deal from having a pediatric residency and an adult endocrine fellowship. And everything I know, I learned from Ralph Peterson.
Oh, what was he like as a mentor?
Mm-hmm. Well, he was an unusual mentor. He spent most of the day in the laboratory. And my picture of Dr. Peterson is him with a pipette in his mouth working and being unwilling to speak to anyone while he was doing his job. But if you wanted to have a conversation about your work, you could come in, and his door was open at 1 a.m. Now, you know, I'm a young mother and I have young children, so coming in at 1 a.m. to go over my work wasn't the easiest thing in the world, but it was always worth it. He would sit, he'd analyze, he'd tell you what you were doing wrong, tell you what you were doing right, and encourage you always. And if I can tell you a funny vignette, the way I used to work my life is I would come home, cook dinner, have dinner with my husband and the children, get them to bed, and then go back to the lab, waiting to speak with Dr. Peterson. And in those days, you ran what was called liquid chromatography. There were tanks of chromatography where I was trying to separate steroids. And one night I came in and I had forgotten my key to the chromatography room, but my usual dress under such circumstances was a nightgown with a raincoat over it. And I called the security guard and I said, I'm stuck, I left my key, can you open the chromatography room? And he looked and he saw my nightgown and he said, no. And so I realized that Dr. Peterson's light was on, so I said, well, let's go. My boss is right down there and he'll tell you who I am. So I knocked on the door and Dr. Peterson opened the door and the guy said, this woman says she's Dr. New. And Peterson looked down and saw my outfit. He said, I don't know her. So we had to go back, and he finally recanted, and I'd got my work done. So those were very good years.
What did he teach you as far as developing your career? Did he help you in that way?
Yes, he did. Besides teaching me the science of steroids, and he still is an unsung hero, I think. He taught me, stick to the task and the rewards will come. Never think of the reward first. And then he had another thing which I still haven't learned. If you want people to listen to you, speak softly. Make it hard for them to hear. And I remember that somebody came into his office and was complaining about, I don't know, something or other, and, you know, I'm going to leave if you don't fix this. And Dr. Peterson, I remember standing there, went like this, goodbye. And it was over.
And what research were you doing in this period?
What I was doing was really pioneering work. Very little was known about steroid synthesis and metabolism in children. And I think I was the first one to ever study the salt-retaining hormone aldosterone in children. And I learned how to measure it in a method that Dr. Peterson had developed. Very difficult, double isotope dilution derivative technique. Now they do it by radioimmunoassay and now by tandem spec. But at that time, this was a very difficult technique, but I learned it. And in the process of learning, I really learned steroids like my bread and butter, and that's because Dr. Peterson would demand that. If you couldn't draw the steroid you were trying to measure, he'd sit you down and say, don't come and see me till you've learned this. And so I did learn it, and it has stood me in good stead throughout my subsequent career.
And following your fellowship with Dr. Peterson, you were appointed chief pediatric
At Cornell.
Pediatric. Now, when you started out at Cornell, what was known about steroid disorders in children?
There hadn't been much. There had been some very good work done out of Johns Hopkins, where Dr. Lawson Wilkins, the father of pediatric endocrinology, had done some work. And Claude Mijon and Bob Blizzard, Judson Van Wyck, and Mel Grumbach had all worked in that group. And I always felt very deficient because I never worked for Lawson Wilkins. I worked for Ralph Peterson. But in the end, I think I learned a great deal and I was okay. So what we pushed forward under Ralph Peterson was that we began to describe a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, in which I'm now recognized as an expert. But the fundamental work was done while I was a fellow with Ralph Peterson, and it proved to be not an infrequent disease. And it has the result of causing genital ambiguity in girls when the girl is affected. And so one of the great triumphs is that on my own, I started a program in the US which had just occurred in France, which is to treat mothers, to treat the fetus at risk for this disease so that she could be born with normal genitalia. And that was very important work because you replaced what was missing in the fetus, and at the same time you stopped the genital ambiguity, which required genital surgery. And the genital surgery is very difficult, it's mutilating, and now the results are coming out in those girls who had had genital surgery, and the results are sort of catastrophic in adult women because they never can have sexual intercourse because they get, not never, but I mean very difficult, because they end up with vaginal stenosis. So the fact that prenatal treatment could prevent this and that you didn't need the surgery which caused abnormalities of the genitalia as a result of the surgery, there was another option for parents who were at risk to having a child like this.
Now, the molecular tools that you needed to be able to do this, where did you get those skills?
I have to tell you that that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud of. I had to learn molecular genetics because I was too old to learn it in school. It hadn't been taught in school. So I learned it kind of, I don't know how to say this, on the hoof. I was reading molecular genetics, and I hired someone from Columbia who still works with me by the name of Bob Wilson. And I learned it from Bob, I learned it from reading, I learned it from my patients. And it took a while before I was good enough to troubleshoot, but I did learn it.
And what led to your discovery of apparent mineralocorticoid excess?
Yeah. Well, I had been studying the sodium-retaining hormone aldosterone. I told you that. And I got a call from Ed Bilieri, who worked in San Francisco, and he said, you know, I've just been asked to see a little Zuni Indian child, and I don't deal with children who are 3 years old, Maria. Would you go there? It happened that I was on my way, and I said, but I'd stop at the Zuni reservation. And they presented this little girl to me, and I knew I'd never seen anything like it before. I also knew that I couldn't work her up in the Zuni Indian reservation, and I asked if they would allow me to bring her to New York. I'll never forget this because they agreed. It's a matrilineal society, so the person who makes the decisions is the mother. And they said, okay. And I said, well, I'll only take the child if the mother will come too. So they said, yes, but you have to understand that we regard the parents of this child as being incestuous. And it was to do with the fact that the Zuni Indians divide their tribes into clans. And my little girl belonged to the Turkey clan. And the parents are not supposed to both be from the Turkey clan. And so they both were. And so while I was there, they said, so to purify this mating, we have to kill a deer. Well, I said, you know, you can do anything, but I'm not going to be there. And so they did do it. And I did take Lisa, the little girl, to New York. And I called my husband ahead of time. I said, be ready. My husband was a psychoanalyst. And I said, they've never seen a bridge. They've never seen a river. I think there's going to be big shock. And so he met me at the airport. They'd never flown, of course. And I was amazed how there never was one word of protest or surprise. The Zuni way is to be silent. And I took care of this little girl. It took me 3 years to find out what she had. She had devastatingly high blood pressures. And I found out that she suffered an enzyme defect, which all of us have to protect us from this kind of high blood pressure. And so I called her a prismatic case because she opened a whole new field of biology. And it was very helpful to me to understand this. I now have more than half of the patients in the world because it's extremely rare. And I think it's probably my biggest discovery.
Could you say a little bit more about that concept you have with prismatic case?
Well, I wanted to explain that when I worked out what Lisa had, see, the way all of us protect ourselves from this natural hormone we have called hydrocortisone or cortisol is we convert it to an inactive steroid called cortisone. And cortisone is inactive because it can't enter the receptor. So we all balance this out through an enzyme that does that conversion, which is called 11-beta HSD2. If you lack that enzyme on the basis of a genetic defect, what happens is all the cortisol is active, bioactive, and it enters the receptor for the salt-retaining hormones and drives up the blood pressure. And you can stop it by blocking the receptor with a receptor blocker, and that's how we treated her. Nevertheless, she went back to the Zuni reservation, and at the age of 16 died, I think, because she stopped taking her medication. And it was heartbreaking because I was so attached to her. She used to spend all her Christmases with my children. And I could do nothing to stop this. And I must tell you that I got a call. I was on the studies section at the NIH, and I got a call from the mother who told me that Lisa had died. And I said, of what? And she said, the next door neighbor was murdered, and Lisa loved him, and she died of a broken heart. And that's a special way of thinking, so that the mother protected herself in a way from saying that she stopped taking her medication. I don't know why she died.
Now, how has this work affected?
Would you say the diagnosis of steroid
Yeah.
diseases in general?
All my life, what I've been trying to do is study the mechanism of disease where steroids were involved. And that is why I got this big grant, which is called the Rare Genetic Disease Grant, but this is for steroid disorders. And I think it was more largely on the basis of the discovery of apparent mineralocorticoid excess that I was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. I think that's the reason. I don't know, but certainly it must have been one of the things that helped.
Now, you were president of the Endocrine Society.
I was.
What were the most compelling issues that you were involved with when you were the president of the Endocrine Society?
The year that I was president was the year that the women in the Endocrine Society wanted a stronger role than they had. And there was a great push on me to do something about it. So we developed the Women's Caucus, which is a way for women to meet and discuss issues that affect women, not only in endocrinology, but in careers and what to do, how to work, you know. And you know, one of the things that I failed to say is that Peterson's lesson to me is the most important thing that governs your career is who you choose as a mentor. And this was something that was very important to tell women, you know. It's all very well to get perfect A's and perfect scores, but you better find a man or a woman who will be your mentor and who isn't so interested in themselves that they won't help you. Because you can have very brilliant mentors who don't care about or are not interested in teaching and helping the person training with them. And you could have somebody who maybe is less brilliant but is more giving, who really helps you.
And in what ways has the Endocrine Society supported your professional development?
Well, I think that in many ways the Endocrine Society is my scientific family. I know them. The ones that have become my friends are firm friends. They can help me. And topic for another conversation, I was eased out of Cornell after 49 years. That's why now I'm at Mount Sinai. And the people who came out to help me were my endocrine colleagues, you know, who would call the dean up and say, what have you done, and things like that. Nevertheless, I'm very glad I chose endocrinology for my career. I'm very glad that I learned genetics to combine it with endocrinology. And now that I have 10 grandchildren, I'm very disappointed that not one of them wants to do what I do. But anyway, I can't change that. My eldest grandson is at the University of Chicago studying ancient languages. He's now learning Coptic. So when I said, Zach, what are you going to do to earn a living? They still call me by my Italian name for grandmother, Nonnina. Oh, don't worry, Nonnina, I'll probably become a lawyer eventually. So I'm going to let them do what they like and hope they're all good, ethical, wonderful kids, and that's all I ask.
One more question about just what your current views of the field of endocrinology. How would you?
I think that it is moving at a very fast pace. I think the insertion of molecular genetics into endocrinology has been a very important advance. And if you attend papers, like I attended Dr. O'Malley's paper yesterday on nuclear receptors, it's an explosion of knowledge. It's fantastic. And my view of endocrinology is that it's probably moving faster than most other fields. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.